Elsewhere in the world, citizens are putting their energy and votes towards a more progressive, dare I say, socialist future? In New Zealand, Labour Party leader and current president Jacinda Ardern crushed her right-wing political competition with a resounding re-election win anchored on her mature, science-based, public health first, corporate greed last response to the COVID-19 pandemic. Meanwhile, down in South America, in one of the United States' favorite playgrounds for political manipulation, the people of Bolivia appear to be saying corporate greed, U.S.-backed coup d'etats no more. As the Washington Post reports that exit polls issued early Monday showed Bolivia's socialists taking a seemingly insurmountable lead in the country's bitterly fought presidential elections. This comes just a year after the Organization of American States, or OAS, threw Bolivia's electoral process into chaos with unproven accusations of vote rigging against then-sitting President Evo Morales, the country's first indigenous-born president. This, as you remember, helped trigger a military coup that eventually saw the installation of right-wing Christian zealot and U.S. State Department favorite Jeanine Áñez as interim president and forced Morales to flee for his life to Mexico and then Argentina. Well, now as the numbers continue to pour in, showing a major victory for Morales' former finance minister, Luis Arce, the former president tweeted out, quote, "Brothers and sisters, the will of the people has been asserted. This is an overwhelming victory. We are going to give dignity and liberty back to the people." Two major progressive socialist wins coming on the eve of one of the biggest U.S. presidential elections in history. And joining us today to bring us some on-the-ground insight into this historic election in Bolivia is the Latin American campaign coordinator of Code Pink and Bolivian election observer, Leonardo Flores. Leonardo, thank you so much for coming on today.
Thank you for having me on.
So first, I want to ask you, you're down in Bolivia. What are the people in Bolivia saying about this huge win for Luis Arce, the former Minister of Economy and Public Finance under Morales? And what did you witness as an observer?
So I think the people are incredibly relieved. First of all, that there's been no post-electoral violence. The fact that the MAS won with over 50% of the vote means that, the country firmly supports it. And prior to this week, there was many scenarios in which the MAS would squeak out a victory, and then we might have seen another coup happen, or we might have seen electoral authorities try to annul the results. But since it's such a resounding victory, I think Bolivia is safe for now. What I witnessed yesterday was a day of calm and peaceful voting. I witnessed very few irregularities. There were some isolated reports of people being disqualified for basically purged from the voter rolls, but there was nothing to suggest that this was a tendency. In fact, the most irregular thing about the whole night was the fact that the results came in so late after midnight, despite the fact that we were promised at 8 o'clock. And so the results that we got aren't actually exit polls. They were pictures taken of the tally sheets by private companies and then compiled, basically. So these are unofficial results. They're stronger than polls, and the TSC, Bolivia's electoral authority, is going to certify the results later this week.
Wow.
And Leonardo, how much of a role has U.S. corporate interests played in Bolivia's politics, and how does that affect the election and the interest there?
Well, the corporate, right, and through USAID, the U.S. Agency for International Development, and through WikiLeaks, we basically know that for 20 years now, even before Evo Morales was elected president, USAID had an eye on him. The U.S. Embassy here wrote cables warning that he went to power, warning that he was going to be popular and he was going to have the support of the bases. So 20 years ago, 5 years before he even became president, they started a strategy of trying to undermine him. And part of what they did was they would finance these so-called civic organizations, particularly in Eastern, which has a strong separatist movement, which is where the indigenous is represented, where there are more kind of people of white European ancestry. And so the Santa Cruz was very key in terms of carrying out this coup, and a lot of funding goes to not just Fernando Camacho, who's from Santa Cruz and who was one of who came third in the elections, but really to everyone in the Bolivian opposition, the neoliberals and fascists alike. They receive funding from the U.S. and they have strong corporate ties, of course. And of course, Bolivia has vast lithium reserves, and there's a good reason to believe that lithium played a key role in this coup.
Lithium being what powers a lot of our technology today. Now, given the recent progressive wins we're seeing in New Zealand and Bolivia, are we seeing a new trend towards more progressive and socialist leadership in the world?
I mean, it certainly looks that way, right? Because in Argentina, the neoliberal Macri lost within the last year. And we're going to see elections in Ecuador in next year, and it's very likely that the socialists will come to power in Ecuador. But, these are trends that are happening all over the world. But at the same time, we have fascist parties on the rise and in power, say, for example, in Brazil or in El Salvador, or some might argue in the U.S.
Do you think that do you think that this kind of engagement and this really, given the nature of what's going on with COVID today, given the nature of climate change, given the nature of the tremendously, tremendous wealth gaps, are we going to see a more socialist trend in the United States, kind of following the lead in Bolivia and these other countries that you mentioned?
Well, I mean, we saw a lot of excitement with Bernie Sanders' campaign, of course, but he failed just like he failed 4 years ago. So I think it's going to take a long time for socialism to really take root in the United States. I mean, the fact that there's so many young people interested in socialism bodes well in that regard. But anti-socialist feminist discourse is so rampant in the U.S. and is so kind of built into the DNA of the country that I think it will be much more difficult. If anything, we might see slightly more progressive policies. Certainly not because of, say, Joe Biden, but from pressure from below.
And what would you say were the breakdown of the voters there? I know here in America, we're looking at the trends between some of the younger voters, many leaning more with the socialist trend versus those that are older, women voters and things like that. We're breaking it down demographically. What were some of the key demographics for the win that you guys just saw?
I mean, the main demographic is basically race, whether a person is indigenous or not. So, for example, last night, as I was observing the elections, I ended my night in a stronghold for the opposition candidate for Carlos Mesa, who's a neoliberal, and they have about 50 voting booths in that precinct. Of those 50 voting booths, 48 went to Mesa, and only 2 went for Arce, the mass candidate. And then when I asked the people why, they said that the voting booths are basically separated by last name, and at those particularly 2 voting booths, they had indigenous last names voted there. And so basically the indigenous vote won in those 2 other places, whereas in the other 48, it was kind of a more middle class, upper middle class, kind of mixed or white heritage. Those went for the neoliberal candidate. And then when we see the rural vote come in, that is almost exclusively indigenous, and that is where the Mas's power base is, and they won handily in rural areas.
Well, I got to thank you very much for your service there and keeping an eye on the voting that took place there. And thank you very much for coming on and educating our audience on what took place in Bolivia over the weekend. It's definitely interesting to follow where that's going and where those voting trends will take us into the future. Thank you so much for all your hard work.